She's the producer of Case Number Zero, which is a fantastic podcast series as well, Country of Gamblers. And then we also have Andrew Harding, who is a fantastic correspondent for BBC Africa, and he's responsible for the really excellent podcasting series Bloodlands, which I recommend you can look for on your podcasting app, but also on BBC Sounds. I'm doing this. It's really fantastic. Maybe we can move over to you, Vincho, first of all, where you just introduce a little bit more of your podcasting work.
Thank you so much, Paul. So my podcasting work is mostly investigative podcast, and so far we have 2 pods out, which you mentioned. Case Number Zero, which is about a missing Kenyan journalist, and Country of Gamblers, which is about gambling in Kenya and the regulations around that and how that affects the day-to-day lives of like everyday Kenyans.
Brilliant. And they're both very uniquely Kenyan series, aren't they? I mean, they're really sort of and they really tap into like the sort of traditional serialized investigative formats, but I really felt that there was no way of mistaking that I was listening to something from NPR or something from the UK. It was very much like you've kind of started to develop your own African style.
Right. So going on to this, James Smart, who's my partner, and our goal is to tell stories in a Kenyan way that like uniquely Kenyan and have a DNA of whichever place they're coming from. We are currently developing like a podcast series in Nigeria, and it's going to be uniquely Nigerian in terms of language, but also pacing and how we bring about the storytelling elements. So it's very deliberate.
Great. We can definitely get back into, especially this idea of language. I really want to get back into in a little bit. Molly, could you please tell us a little bit more about Afripods? We've had a number of conversations about the company, and it's all incredibly exciting. And I understand you're in Joburg this week. So could you give us a little bit more background of it?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I think this is a perfect segue just off of Vincho, because we've actually been highlighting specifically those investigative podcasts, and they've been performing really well in Kenya. So my name is Molly. I'm the CEO of Afripods. We are a Pan-African podcasting platform based in Nairobi, Kenya. And like Paul mentioned, I'm actually currently in Johannesburg meeting with podcasters and media companies. So if anyone in the audience is in Joburg, feel free to hit me up.
And Molly, are you sort of seeing, especially on the investigative side, like you say that you're seeing sort of a hunger for that kind of content? Do you sort of see it growing? Do you see the sort of potential and it's sort of growing on the continent?
Absolutely, without question. I mean, there are so many stories from the continent that just we haven't heard. And now with podcasts giving people more global reach to stories that they want, I think that this investigative journalism as a podcast has really kind of globally exploded in the West. And it would be, what we're seeing is in alignment with it actually growing here on the continent as well.
Brilliant. And then I just wanted to move to Andrew. He's the co-producer of a series called Bloodlands, like I said. Could you go into a little bit more about, Andrew, about what Bloodlands is about? And it's sort of, I mean, I know it's many episodes, but I listened to it all in one go. And it's a fantastic series. Could you go into a little bit about sort of creating an African investigative series, you know, as someone from an entity like the BBC?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Paul. I'm Andrew Harding. I'm in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape right now, doing some filming about climate change and the drought, the terrible drought in the Karoo, not far from here. But yes, I made Bloodlands with Becky Lipscomb, a very good, excellent BBC producer, a couple of years ago. It actually started first as a book project and then as a radio series, which in a way really controlled particularly the way we delivered it, that it was 5 relatively short episodes, which I found sort of fascinating for me, having done lots of radio documentaries, but they tend to be sort of one-off, 1 hour or half hour, and lots of TV and so on, not suddenly to have this new format, to have these relatively short, it was actually 14 and a half minutes times 5. And it really forced me to think very hard about the hooks and the structure and how to keep the momentum going between each episode, which is something I'd never done before. And then we did expand them slightly for a podcast version. But I'm very interested in the sort of tension between the beauty and the freedom of podcasts, where you have in space, and the discipline and the tautness that you get when you have that time restriction that you have in traditional radio format. So the story we focused on was a double murder investigation in the Free State, which is the kind of high flatlands in the center of South Africa, a big farmland area, a lot of white farmers. And I'd stumbled on this case of 2 black farm workers who'd been brutally assaulted by a group of about 30 or 40 white farmers. The white farmers suspected these 2 men were thieves, and they beat them up, assaulted them so severely that over the course of the next few hours, both men died. And we decided to follow the case for what turned out to be about 4 years from the initial assault through to the final verdict. And in fact, the sentencing, which only ended just a few weeks ago, it's been a case that's really exposed a lot about the failings of South Africa's institutions, and also has dug into these really tough, difficult issues about race, about land, and about these communities being torn apart in South Africa.
And I'm fascinated by, because like you say, it was a book project as well. And I read the accompanying book, and there's so much detail in that book. And I'm interested in this idea of like discipline, because I think people think about podcasts and as, you know, and they think of like almost like a Joe Rogan model where they can talk for 3 hours and there's this endless freedom. But that idea that you're basically still beholden to attention spans, and really trying to keep people that tension, I think is really interesting. I wanted to move along to this idea of telling very complicated stories with audio, because I've had a lot of experience in community radio, and I think that there's a huge potential on the African continent of like telling complicated investigative stories with audio. And at the moment, like podcasting is still sort of finding its feet. But Molly, I wanted to ask you about what you think of that potential in terms of getting, you know, because we kind of think of print usually as telling like incredibly complicated investigations, but now there's an opportunity to do that in podcasting. And I wanted to just ask like what you think is going to make more people adopt podcasting, especially people that are maybe not used to this level of journalism.
Sure, and that's a wonderful question, Paul. I think something to note, just to scale out a little bit, is that we know that the continent is mobile first, and that they're very familiar with the audio format. The radio is still king here. So when you talk about stories and how they're perceived, a lot of times you're looking through a Western lens, which tends to be that written format. And that's the way that generally people were getting long form investigative reports. I think with a medium that's already so well received on the continent that people are comfortable in, it allows us the opportunity to get stories to people the way they want to. And then it becomes more exciting because of the layers underneath it. So that includes getting stories, investigative stories that may not have been told in other languages or in different regions of the continent or countries. And I think it kind of allows the traditional long form written story to kind of blossom in a different way. And, you know, ultimately what I think anyone wants to do as a creator is meet their audience where they are. So I'm really excited to see how that will kind of explode.
Vincho, do you have anything to add to that idea?
I mean, I agree with Molly that radio is not new to the continent, and podcasts, even though they're new, actually I see them reaching more people than, for example, TV and even print medium, because now people just be listening and they can listen to podcasts on the go. So I think this is like an exciting time for podcasts that's being produced. And I speak this because I watch a lot of African vlogs on YouTube and all that, and they all tend to be like comedic, and very, very few of them are like doing the heavy investigative, or even dramas are like rare to find in the video system. So I feel like podcasts, because they're not that expensive to produce, give us a leeway to tell more stories and tell them properly with the time that we want to take to tell the stories.
Can you go into a little bit on case number 0? Because I love that series. Could you explain it a little bit in a bit more detail for people, and also maybe like what you were able to do in that investigation as a podcast that you perhaps wouldn't have been able to do in print or in video?
Yeah, so case number 0 began as a documentary, believe it or not. And because it was so difficult to put the financing together to then cut the footage and release the documentary, we decided to make it a podcast. So, and actually, partly because of COVID, because once COVID happened, I felt like I might die anytime. And I've interviewed so many people over like years since 2015 about Bogonko Busiria, and it felt like, if I die, what's going to happen to this footage? And then that birthed the idea of making a podcast out of it. And for those people who are not familiar with it, case number 0 traces the final days of a missing Kenyan journalist and blogger. And we're trying to figure out what actually happened to him. We still don't figure out what happened to him, but like, it's just that journey of putting 2 and 2 together and seeing if we can amount to something.
Yeah, I mean, what I loved about that series is you also got a huge sense of journalism in Kenya. You weren't just telling the story of this man, you were sort of giving a snapshot of journalism in Kenya in general. Andrew, I wanted to ask about, we touched on it a little bit, but the sort of beyond the idea of having to be very economical with your time, what other kinds of changes, for good or bad, do you think goes when you convert an investigation into audio, like particularly where, in terms of being able to reach more people?
What was a huge learning experience for me, actually, in the writing of Bloodlands, was the sheer amount of time you need to think about keeping the audience unconfused, just steering them through and making sure you strip out any extra name that isn't absolutely essential, and you keep reminding them, remember this guy, I mentioned him earlier, remember he's the one who did that. Because what we did early on was play these episodes through to people as we were making it, putting them together in London, and people would be going, hang on, just that guy, I know you mentioned him, but people don't listen as closely as you do. And that way of trying to, a discipline of getting people just to know where they are and never feel too confused, except when you want them to be confused, was a real learning experience for me. And just going back to what Vincho was saying, and Molly, about the audience. One of the lucky things with working for the BBC, of course, is that you do it for a podcast, you also do it for radio, and then you also make an hour-long version for the World Service Radio, and then it gets on lots of different platforms. And certainly I'm curious what you all think about the price of access to mobile technology in other parts of Africa, because certainly from a listenership point of view in South Africa, data is very expensive. And so I wonder, what I worry is that you're pricing out a huge segment of the population when they're needing to pay for this stuff. Whereas radio, which I still have a great loyalty and love to, and which makes up still the vast majority of the BBC audience in Africa, much of it now on FM, but still on shortwave some places, but it's free. And it's there all the time, and it's so much more powerful when it comes to just getting those numbers and reaching those huge audiences.
Molly, do you think, can you sort of respond to that and answer that question a bit?
Sure. Actually, I spend a lot of time reading and doing research on this, because that is, I think, one of the major keys that will crack the nut into getting more information digitally, right? So we know from the Affordable Internet Alliance that data is extremely expensive across the continent, free Wi-Fi, especially in the cities. And I think being that there are organizations like the Affordable Internet Alliance that are working towards figuring out how to create a solution to make this more accessible and affordable, when that happens, we're going to be in a real exciting shift that's really currently happening right now. So my thoughts is that it's more of a systemic issue, right? We still have to build the infrastructure around what podcasting is going to look like and how you get this information out. But there are current steps being taken that I hope in the next couple of years will allow more people to get access to this type of information and storytelling.
Vincho, do you have anything to add to this, to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to point out in Nigeria and in Kenya that if you subscribe, you get like a subscription to internet, then you get free, I think 2 GB of internet to watch YouTube videos. And I envision a future where then you get 2 GB to download however number of podcasts that you want to download for free, like they're doing for YouTube. And this is like not just Kenya, Nigeria, I know it's happening in Uganda, but it's also like the service provider, the internet service providers have to start looking into this, but they can only look into that if there's enough podcasts to warrant that, just as there's too much YouTube content that warrants free YouTube subscription.
I actually am fascinated with another level of complexity to this, in that more and more my favorite podcasts are being made exclusive. Like they're being made exclusive to platforms, primarily Spotify. So basically, if you want to stay listening, you have to download the Spotify app and keep listening on Spotify. And I find that and in the internet, like, you know, podcasting Twitter is like losing its mind over this, right? Because they're kind of like, this is not what podcasting is about. Podcasting is meant to be free for everyone. And it's kind of like, I guess at this stage, sort of saying like, well, that's what you wish the internet was like, you know, free for everyone. But anyone who's had to fund the production of one of these things, like these investigations, is like, if Spotify came knocking and offered a whole lot of money for you to produce something, you probably would say yes, right? And then down the line, they might just turn the switch, and then it becomes exclusive to Spotify. And in that, obviously, especially in Africa, in the fact that Spotify isn't even available in all the countries on the continent, becomes a huge problem. I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about that, or like, and I think that the BBC is a fantastic sort of exception, in that, like, no matter what their podcasting strategy is, they will still have these radio stations. That, Andrew, what do you sort of think about that, first of all, in terms of podcasting becoming, as more money is poured into it, the high-end productions almost become kind of exclusive?
I'm in a lucky position that I don't have to spend my days worrying about this, because I still
yeah,
work
exactly.
full time for the BBC. But I do know that a lot of people, and I'm sure Vincho and Molly are very involved in this, spend a lot of time trying to work out, like so much of journalism and the new media, how to reach a big audience, but make money, or at least, you know, balance the books. And it seems to be still a very difficult issue, and it's you know, it's a frustration for me. For instance, we've just done a new podcast, which again came from a radio series. So again, it was the same 5-part, 15-minute format, and it's about Jacob Zuma, South Africa's former president, and it's called Poison. And I tried to kind of explore his obsession with being poisoned. He's convinced he's the victim of numerous attempts to poison him, as a way to explain how South Africa got from the horrors of apartheid through to the kind of madness of recent uprisings and the violence we saw in Durban earlier this year, and the sort of political populism that Zuma now has embraced. And it's landed without any noise in South Africa itself, because I think people, by and large, are not aware of podcasts or aware of the BBC very much. You really need these things on the internet, on newspapers and on websites rather than on the radio and on podcasts here. That's my sort of experience so far.
Did it change? Because I just finished listening to that series, and it's very compelling, and I think a lot of South Africans would enjoy it. But did it make? It obviously appeared on Radio 4 in the UK, so you must have had traction kind of outside of South Africa on it.
Yeah, and in theory, anyone can access it from that Radio 4 version, but also we have made an hour-long version, which will be running at some point on radio, on the World Service, BBC World Service. So hopefully that will give it some traction. But again, that's not widely listened to here in South Africa, whereas in many parts of Africa, the World Service still is a formidable player in the radio landscape. So that's, again, back to radio rather than podcasting.
Molly, what do you think of this idea of sort of premium podcasts having to maybe go exclusive on certain platforms? What do you think about that?
Thank you, Paul. I actually have an interesting example of something that we've been doing in Kenya. So on the continent, obviously, you want to make sure that you're removing as many barriers to entry as possible. And that means making as much content as available as it can be for people. So Spotify is an amazing example. They're expanding on the continent, and I think that they're doing some great heavy lifting in terms of educating the audience as to, or consumers, as to what podcasts are. An example I can kind of give you exactly with Afripods is that, people are really resistant to downloading apps, whether it's because of bandwidth, storage, or data. So you'll see people who would rather go to youtube.com rather than to download a YouTube app. So what we've done is we've actually partnered with some of the larger media organizations, namely, the first one that comes to mind is Nation Media. James Smart is working with Vincho on some of these podcasts, so kind of tying that together. But what we've done is we put embedded web players on their website under a specific audio section. And Nation Media is the #1 media company in East Africa with outlets in multiple countries, including Uganda, Rwanda, etc. So I think a good example of trying to come up with a creative solution is really getting it meeting people where they are. Forgive me, I was trying to say this in a different way. And premium podcasts, they may work in the West, but what I believe is that the way that podcasting looks in the West may not be how it looks on the continent. And so there are going to be tons of there are going to be tons of things that are the same, right? Whether we're going to be measuring ourselves to IAB standards or what a podcast is, et cetera, but there are going to be specific cultural nuances that exist only on the continent. And I think premium podcasts, I hope all these podcasters get paid. I'm here to see African creators take up as much space as possible, get paid for their content, and tell their story the way that they want to. But I think from a reach perspective, specifically here, it's going to have to look different.
Vincho, do you have something to add to this argument?
I mean, I'm not hating on premium podcasts. I think that the way we do it in Africa, or like my suggestion would be have a premium for 6 months, 7 months, and then let it out to make it free for everyone else, just so that people are paid. But also, like, once something is premium, its value kind of goes high, so people want to get in, and it's also like a marketing strategy for me. But it comes down to Afripods and people like Spotify and how they want to roll out this.
Okay, great. And Vincho, I wanted to ask you, so you're kind of originally in film, right? And you've kind of moved into podcasting. I wanted to know, like, for people at the conference who might be film or print journalists, or even radio, but not necessarily narrative radio journalists, like, what kind of insights could you give to someone who wants to turn their next investigation into a podcast series? Because that's what you're seeing more and more of. Like, you're seeing, well, I was going to write this as a long form article, but I decided to do it as a podcast. So people that are on the fence about that, what kind of advice can you give them?
I would say that Podcasting is still hard. It's really hard. It's not, it looks easy, but there's a lot of work that goes into it. For example, with case number 0, our workflow was mad because I had to upload the files. We had people in Nairobi like logging everything, and then I'm scripting them and then send them to Gems to then voice the podcast. So it's actually like the workflow is harder than doing a long form article. It's a little bit easier than making a documentary, but like that doesn't even make it much easier. But then you're losing the camera, so you only need the audio bit of making the documentary. But I would say that people should actually not be afraid of like considering that, because whether in radio or print or podcast or TV, the story is king. So how are you telling the story? Like nothing is stronger or like more powerful than a well-told story. And so if you already have the material and you already can envision the story and it's going to be like a well-told story, then like do not hesitate, like go on, do it. And we all learn from our failures. Like you have to do it to fail to then become a pro at it, or do it and succeed, and if you're lucky.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Andrew, what do you think? What in terms of like other journalists who are sort of on the fence of moving into this medium, would you recommend it? Is there any sort of burning advice that you would give them?
I've come at it from, as I say, from the radio background, and what we have been involved in is very sort of high production styles of podcasting, which is very labor intensive. They're mixed back in London with these incredible studio sound engineers who put these music, mood kind of things around all of it and turn, my glossy little words and some clips of interesting interviews into something much closer to kind of drama. That, of course, is not the full story. I know as a podcast consumer that actually podcasting allows you such a range of options in terms of how you make programs. They can be much more conversational and cheap, I suppose, frankly, to do. But what I like about the fact that we're talking to some extent about investigative podcasts is it does seem to me, just purely anecdotally, that there is a real hunger for those kind of investigative stories, journalist stories in so much of Africa. And I've just seen that again as a consumer with something like Africa Eye on the BBC. There, it's a TV show, but it's something that I think of all the output that I've seen from the BBC, it's something that really grips people. People want those deep investigative things using social media, using all these different tools we now have. And I find that very exciting.
Molly, what do you think?
I just firstly would like to say I am a huge fan of BBC Africa Eye, and I watch it all the time, whether it's on YouTube, I see it on my Facebook with the 8-minute clips. They have the 1-hour-long series. I think they do a really beautiful job of telling exciting, authentic African stories. And I think, it's interesting, right? Because BBC is an incredible legacy, massive news organization, and they have the capacity to produce excellent work with people like Andrew, who are just seasoned in many mediums. So I'm excited to kind of have access to a brand like that wants to create content that's for people on the ground. And then kind of tying that to Vincho, and the first thing she said in this conversation we're having is being deliberate in telling your stories. And that's something I think I would say across the board comes across, right? A lot of what I see when I engage with people on the continent is people looking for authenticity and, being deliberate in telling stories that relate to the people on the ground. That ties into community. And community is such a massive pillar of life on the continent, right? There's expressions, it takes a village, everyone knows. So I think all of this ties together in a really beautiful way, but I was mostly excited that Andrew brought up Africa Eye because they're killing it. I love the stories they tell. And I have a BBC Africa Eye podcast. So just throwing that one out there.
Okay,
I wish
great.
I had the ability to wave a magic wand and make that happen, but I'm a little low down the feeding chain on that. But yes, it's a good point. And what's lovely about radio and podcasting, of course, is that although, I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with producers who are a bit like me, but more so obsessed about the quality of the sound, and they have multiple microphones. And, you know, I remember with Bloodlands, I produced some recordings I'd made early on, and my producer was just like, no, or we're going to have to do those again. But actually, you know, an iPhone or anything can actually record pretty good broadcastable sound in the way that, of course, they can also produce, you know, great broadcastable images as well in the hands of somebody without that much experience.
Vincho, I kind of, as a segue into that, I wanted to get into the idea of language. You mentioned it at the top of the panel, and I kind of feel that it's a huge it's a huge opportunity for producers to kind of work in local languages, but then at the same time, it's a huge obstacle for people who don't speak those languages, like me, basically. So what has been your experience of that in terms of people's hunger for something in their local language? I imagine it must be huge. But then on the other side, in terms of funding something, is that a stumbling block if you say that you're not going to be able to do an English version, or do you think about doing it in 2 languages? What has been your experience of that?
So it's not just a stumbling block to you. I mean, non-Swahili speakers, for example, in Kenya's case, it's also like within Africa, there are multiple languages. So with case number 0, when I interviewed Bogonko's parents, they were speaking Kisi. And Kisis are not even like the largest community or tribe in Kenya. They're like one of the smaller spoken languages in Kenya. But the parents could only express themselves in, like, they chose to speak in Kisi. They actually speak good English, but they decided to speak in Kisi. The biggest, like, and then we had people, Kenyans, saying, come on, like, translate that. We don't know what they're saying. We want to know what they're saying. And then we translated that. We had a voice actor come in, but then we lost the emotion. So it's like, as these 2 things are play, and how do you find the middle ground? And with like moving forward, I fully believe that we should do more podcasts in our local languages. Like Nigeria right now, when I listen to a Yoruba podcast or an Igbo podcast, because there's multiple millions of Yorubas. But at the same time, you want it to be accessible to the rest of Nigeria. And so it comes down to, like, can you do both? Or can you, like, you have to decide what you're willing to sacrifice. And this is a hard one. This is a tough one. Like, yeah, I'm still figuring it out.
Yeah, it is something that's kind of in flux, right? Molly, what about you in terms of Afripods and in terms of local languages and bringing those in? Because I imagine that's a large part of, you know, what you're striving for as well.
Absolutely. I actually have pretty strong feelings about this. So content creators, podcasters, they can create content however they want to. And I think the beauty of being in Africa is that you have 1.3 billion people, 1,500 plus languages, 54-ish countries, depending on the day, right? And I think getting these stories in Sheng and Kiswahili and Amharic, Arabic, Yoruba, Twi, Afrikaans, Kenya Rwandan, like, I could keep going. That's what makes it so beautiful, and that's what makes it uniquely African. And when we look at English being the language that most people are podcasting in, I think it's because podcasting is still seen from a Western lens. Yes, we want people to be able to access this and understand it, but I can give you an example of a podcast that actually came out earlier this year in Kenya called Until Everyone is Free. And they had a gentleman named Stoneface. I believe he's from one of the slums in the area. I don't want to say Kibera, but it might be. And what they did, I went to their launch party, is the whole podcast is in Sheng. Sheng is a dialect of Kiswahili. And basically they had a YouTube that had subtitles. So I had to sit there and read the subtitles. And, you know, the beautiful thing about that is it wasn't for me. Not everything is for me. And it's okay. You know, I mean, I'm hoping, or what we're planning on doing with Afripods is improving searchability and discoverability, which is hard across all podcasting platforms, whether you have categories separated by region or country or language. I feel like these are tags that can be included, and they have to be included when you're talking about building a product for the continent and for the diaspora.
Andrew, do you have, the BBC does huge things to sort of pioneer languages on the continent. Do you have a sense of that being pushed into podcasting in any way, or one of your podcasts being translated at any point, or has that been a conversation at all?
You're right. The BBC spends a lot of time with all its language services, and that's a huge part of what I think is the World Service core kind of role. And I'm sure it always will be, although it's constantly reevaluating which languages it needs in a sort of limited budget world, and with more pressures, I think, coming down the line, which languages it needs to target and why. And there are all sorts of tricky geopolitical and Brexity, British kind of calculations, no doubt, involved in all of that. But I can't remember off the top of my head how many languages the World Service broadcasts in. But podcasts, to my knowledge, mine certainly haven't been translated yet. And I was struck by something Vincho said, and this is coming at it from a different angle, but it is that issue one always faces, particularly with radio, which is such an intimate, and podcasting, such an intimate media. You want to hear people's emotions, and then you have this struggle if you're going to translate them, if you're going to have somebody acting their role, or you're going to have somebody doing a voiceover. Whereas in TV, you have the ability to see their face and to relate to them, at least on that level. With radio, you really lose a chunk when you can't hear somebody speaking. So I find it very difficult, because obviously here I am striding around the continent asking people who speaks English, because I need that as often as possible. And the danger, of course, is that there's an element of self-selection involved in that you tend to go more towards the people who do speak English, and you're then denied the opportunity, or you're denying people who don't speak English, or who frankly just don't want to speak English. And you were talking about the Kisi family there, who quite rightly say, well, I can speak perfectly well English, but I choose to express myself in my native language. So there are all sorts of complexities there, and there's money involved as well. You've got to hire translators, you've got to make sure those translators are good, and that can take a while. So a lot of issues come into all of that.
Vincho, do you have anything to respond to that?
No, I'm just agreeing with him that the emotion is something that is very important to any story. And how do you maintain that or retain that? Like I said, I'm just still trying to figure that out myself.
This is an interesting question, and like something that I think about a lot, and that is posed to me quite a lot in terms of the emotional side of these investigations, and how that might step on the ethics of the journalism, right? So there's a few things, sort of the high emotional content, the personal story often of the narrator. There's sort of a trend in some podcasts to find, say, if someone has been killed. I forget the name, but there was a podcast last year that won at the Third Coast Festival that was investigating the death of a young boy, and they got his mother to narrate it. Okay, which I thought was a good hook, but it kind of starts to blur all sorts of lines in terms of this being an investigation, when you've got the mum very emotionally being your host to this investigation, and obviously there's a bunch of journalists who work on it, but like that kind of blurs that line. And also I think that there's that personal element, but also the structure of withholding information and then letting it go at certain times throughout your story, which some people have brought up to me is almost unethical in terms of how you tell an investigation, right? And you're using kind of creative nonfiction skills to tell something which maybe should be a little bit more journalistically traditional, I guess, maybe, is something. Vincho, you're nodding there, what do you think about all that?
No, I agree, because James and I, like, these are questions that we asked ourselves so much during the process of making case number 0. And the big reveal is that the father in the end is not doing well. His mind is not all there. And we went there, and I just was like, we cannot air this. We cannot talk about this. And I explained this to the mother and the siblings. But they called us and they said, it's important that the world knows what this has done to our father. And it's just like, our father is this way, but maybe we also end up like our father because we also haven't healed. And so it became like quite important to tell the outcome of the father's story. The thing with podcasts, and this is like a strength and a weakness at the same time, is that you have more time, so you can explore beyond this person disappeared or this person died on this day, and this is what the government is saying. You can go deeper and be like, who was this person to different people? The danger becomes if you rely on the one person that loved this person to tell you, or the one person that hated this person to define the person that has gone missing or has died or whatever. So it's just like, you have, what I try to do is get various points of view. And for example, in the case of Country of Gamblers, if one person says this is what this person did, then I must go to the other person and be like, did you do this thing that he's accusing you of? And that person can be like, I didn't do it. And then I have to like ultimately confess my own feelings towards that, or just let the audience decide. It's like, how do you make these decisions? And for me, it's like, what makes the story stronger, but like also while remaining truthful to the investigation. But yeah, it's a very tricky act.
Andrew, what are your feelings on the sort of ethical, kind of maybe stepping on the ethics during the investigative podcasting format?
Well, you say format, but of course the beauty of podcasting is that there is no format, and they haven't really worked out any rules. In fact, there are no rules, and that's part of the excitement of it. And I think, you know, what Vincho is saying, you're still kind of working these things out. There is a beauty in that kind of warts and all kind of spirit that podcasting has, that you're not going to do these tightly scripted, old-fashioned types of news reports where you decide the version you're telling. Everything's out there, and everything's for the listener to kind of decide, and for the presenter to kind of work out what sort of relationship or role they want to play in crafting that and in combating some of those narratives. And I don't think anyone is close to sort of settling on a prescription for it all, and I don't think they ever will. And in a sense, those old rules, particularly in this new space, don't have to be enforced in the way they still are in, for instance, in the BBC, where we've got very strong regulation about what we can and cannot say, and in newspapers as well, you know, much more traditional in that sense too. So podcasting is the Wild West, and long may it live.
That's great. Molly, what do you think about this issue of, you know, and Andrew's right, like it's kind of the Wild West and it's sort of changing in that way. And what do you think that sort of means for kind of new journalism, or like a new kind of way of doing journalism?
Well, I think my opinion has to be very narrow, as I am not a journalist, and I respect the way that journalists do their craft and the ethics that surround how they get this information. But I do, just to kind of tap on top of what Andrew was saying, that this really is the wild, wild west. There really aren't rules or real barriers or structure yet created. Like, this is something that the creator gets to do and put it out the way that they want to. So I think in regards to that question, I don't want to go too much into it, because I really think that that answer should live with the journalists, but I'm excited to see what happens as more people get into the medium.
I wanted to sort of change tack a bit, and just in terms of, and talk a little bit about the challenges. We spoke a bit about data, and and things like that. But Vincho, I wanted to, last time we spoke, you were producing many different podcast series. I don't know if that is still the case. Like, it sounded like you had more podcast series going on than anyone else I knew. What would you say is the biggest challenge for you as a podcast producer who's trying to, grow podcasting across the continent, but then I guess also like do the projects that you feel most comfortable with? What are your big challenges at the moment? Like, we've spoken a lot about the positivity of podcasts, but I'm also interested in sort of in what is stopping the medium grow.
Right. So yes, I'm still producing podcasts all over. So I'm producing podcasts in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Zambia, in Mozambique. But when I say I'm producing, I'm actually like a supervising producer on this podcast. So there are multiple producers that I'm working with in these countries that are then going out and doing the work, and I'm just like helping them shape the stories and make them ready for audiences. But in terms of challenges, there are way too many. First of all, money. Money is a big one because you need money to move. We are currently like doing an investigative podcast about an activist in Nigeria who went missing, and we have to like send the journalist to Kano, which is, not so safe in Nigeria, to go there and spend time with the family. So then you have to not only pay for the flights there, but you're also trying to ensure that she's safe. So how do you do that? Who are you engaging from the government, from the local community, to make sure that she doesn't die in the course of doing her job? So safety is also an issue when you're doing this kind of thing. When I was doing case number 0, my parents were like, please don't do it because they will kill you. I never once thought that the Kenyan government would come for me because I'm nobody and I don't have the kind of pull. And I said to my parents, I said, first they'll kill Jem Smart before they come for me, so don't worry. But safety is a big issue. And then there's the issue of internet for me, because I'm working in different countries, not everybody has access to the internet, and I need to listen to the podcast and they need to upload it and I give notes, and half the time it's like, we can't do it because they didn't have electricity, so they didn't have internet, so we have to push it 4 days out. I also think that the major media companies in Africa, either they do understand podcasting and want to do it their way, so they don't want to engage with small people like us, or they're just not interested. So there's also like that fight that is pending for us to go and convince them to even give their own journalists money to then produce the kind of work that like Andrew is producing. Like if our own media companies invested in that, then we'd have more investigative podcast series coming from the continent, because I know that they do have a little bit more money than I have. I think that that's most of it. The other thing is that I want to say is, in terms of scripting for podcasts, it's a new format. So if it's 2 people talking, it's fine. But if you're doing like an investigative podcast, then you have to keep track on what happened when, and you have to like log it in a specific way, and you have to like organize in a specific way. And we don't have enough people who have that skill on the continent. And so I'm currently like training some people to just be like the people that can organize information. So
yeah,
I guess that covers it.
I should have brought that up, but like, to me, like, skills is a big thing. We're trying to do a thing at Volume at the moment where we're trying to take people from like community radio stations who have radio experience, and then basically try and skill them up with like almost podcasting, investigative, but also like scripting experience. And it's a fascinating thing to try and do. But yeah, I mean, it's there, like you say, like there's a sort of skills. There needs to be people more that are skilled in this. Andrew, what are your thoughts on this in terms of challenges going forward for the continent?
Well, just following on from that, I was being a bit flippant about Wild West because, of course, in terms of actually the old values about, making sure you've got your lawyers to read stuff through, making sure that you're still ticking the right journalistic boxes. Nothing has changed. And certainly that's been the case with, my limited experience of two podcasts is that, you still have to do the hard work of traditional journalism, even if you're experimenting in all sorts of ways with form. As far as challenges ahead, I think you're right. I think it is about, still the issues that we talked about earlier about making it pay for itself and reaching a wide audience, but also that the training that really is required to make good radio and therefore good podcasts, that it is not simply enough to waft a microphone around and hope you catch something and then talk around a few clips. It really does require, writing skills and basic audio skills as well.
Thank you. So Molly, what do you think? What are your, from a more platform side, a more technical side, what are the big challenges?
Sorry, I was muted. I just listening to both of you, Vincho and Andrew, I really, I can understand a little bit more of what's going on in your head. And I think from a platform perspective, something that I've tried to do as CEO is basically, I understand my role. I am making decisions on behalf of the African on the ground. It's not just what I think, it's not what I see. It's literally speaking to people who are doing this type of work, understanding what their barriers to entry are, and then creating solutions for them so that they can do it. Whether it's, the podcasting equipment is too expensive, figuring out if we can do a studio, or, it's too expensive to create this podcast. Do we have funding? So the challenges that we're looking to solve really come from speaking to people on the ground and creating those solutions. But zooming out a little bit, I do think searchability is a huge challenge just in general from a platform perspective, and being able to find African stories or more granular, find a Malawi story, find a story from Burkina Faso, find any type of story you want. So that's something that is a big challenge that we're going to be working on. Also, obviously, internet, data, bandwidth, storage, which we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, which I think will be changing for the positive, and ultimately just recognizing that this market is so young, right? We're still in our infancy. And when you look at the bell curve, even from, like the Edison Dial report that came out in 2019, they said Africa was 11 years behind. If they were to do that report now, I think that curve would be 2 to 3 years. We're seeing an incredible jump, and we're seeing so many people becoming interested in this medium. I fundamentally believe Africa will be the #1 podcasting market in the world. And that's based off of numbers. That's based off of people being familiar with audio. And that's being that we're now such a global society and culture that, hearing about a serial or an alibi or what's crap on WhatsApp, you now have access to it. You can figure out a way to get it. So I would throw this out here that if anyone does have problems with podcasting, please reach out to me, because I'm looking to create the solutions exactly for what's on the ground. And to kind of close this out, please don't kill James. I know Vincho said that he would go before her, but something that James told me was that, a story can't live and die with you. If there's 20 people that know what's going on, you're all right. And like everything boils down to execution. Nobody has your special sauce. So we're seeing a lot of big companies being interested in podcasting, especially media companies, trying to figure out how to get a piece of the pie. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. The pie is small right now. We want to add to the pie. We know that podcast advertising works. We know that the listen through is high. So I'm ready to ride the wave, and I'm very excited to be able to listen to Vincho and Andrew and you, Paul, really like pioneer this space and just be a part of the infrastructure of it. So sorry, that's a little long-winded, but you guys are very inspiring, and I'm really happy to be here.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And also, we've had a couple of requests in the chat. If media houses and journalists want to reach out to Afripods and partner for content or get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Oh, hi, everyone. Please reach out to me. I'm so available. You can email me My email is mj@afripods.com. So Afripods, AFRIPODS, mj@afripods.com. And we can talk. Ultimately, this is about the Africans on the ground and in the diaspora, and then those who want to connect with African content. I am just trying to build the infrastructure and create this library and make it as accessible as you want it to be. So I'm looking forward to connecting to whoever wants to talk.
Thanks. Vincho, do you have some final thoughts? We actually had a question in the chat, which I think we sort of covered from Mabu, and he asked about investigative podcasts and narrating the story, and it made me think about how you were very involved in case number 0, and you actually admitted that. And we can kind of get into that for days, I think, that idea, but do you have any thoughts, first of all, on that idea of kind of almost putting yourself in the story that people, I think, are still interested in this format? Also, any final thoughts that you have about investigative podcasts in general?
Oh, yeah, no, the whole me being on case number 0 was actually, it took time for me to decide that I needed to be there, and partly there were gaps missing in the story, and I was the only person that was there that could then fill in the gaps. So I had to come in and I had to be like, I'm here, he was my friend, and I made it clear that he was my friend, and James then was like the neutral voice, and I was like the producer, but also the missing person's friend. No, I have nothing more to add except to like really thank you, Paul, for putting this together. And I'm so happy that I was on a panel with you and Molly and Andrew, and it was I learned something today. I'm always trying to learn, and I did learn something, and thank you for doing this.
Brilliant. Yeah, so did I. Andrew, we've just got 2 more minutes. What are any sort of final thoughts or on sort of investigative podcasting in Africa in general?
It's been interesting. I've been back in the UK for a bit, and there's a sense there that there are just too many podcasts. It's all comedians interviewing each other on their own personal podcasts, and a feeling that perhaps the medium needs to go somewhere else, or that it needs to thin down or change or shorten. But I do agree completely with what Molly was saying, that actually the golden age for Africa is clearly still around the corner, and there is so much potential here that I can see for so many great podcasts and series to come out of this continent, and I do think that it can only be a sort of boom time ahead, which is very exciting.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching and listening. Thank you very much to my panelists. I look forward to listening to way more podcasts from all of you on Afripods, and from Vincho and from Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, good.